Trade Winds and the Silk Road, the gritty, tactile, and highly classified history of early knitting. The myth and the muck of the Silk Road. Listener, I want you to picture the Silk Road. If your brain is operating like most modern human brains, you are probably conjuring up a very specific, highly sanitized Hollywood image. You are imagining a pristine, golden, sun-dappled highway stretching seamlessly from the emerald palaces of imperial China straight to the marble columns of Rome. You are picturing serene, unbothered merchants draped in billowing, immaculate fabrics, casually swapping philosophical ideas while sipping tea from perfectly intact porcelain cups. Let us immediately and aggressively disabuse ourselves of this ridiculous notion. The historical imagination has done a tremendous, almost comical disservice to the physical, gritty, and relentlessly uncomfortable reality of ancient global trade. To begin with, the very phrase Silk Road is a relatively modern marketing gimmick. It was coined as recently as 1877 by the German traveler and geographer Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, Ferdinand von Richthofen. The name invokes a pre-modern, cross-continental superhighway, but the historical reality was fundamentally different, infinitely more grueling and categorically filthy. The Silk Road was not a single, paved road at all. It was a shifting, treacherous, multi-directional network of unpaved dirt tracks, mountain passes, and desert trails spanning more than 6,400 kilometers across Central, East, South, and West Asia. The logistics of moving anything across this expanse, let alone impossibly delicate, wildly expensive luxury textiles, were staggering. The journey required traversing environments that seemed actively hostile to the existence of carbon-based life forms. Caravans had to cross the Turfan Basin, a subsea-level depression in western China where summer daytime temperatures regularly soar well above 50 degrees Celsius, before plummeting so dramatically at dusk that hypothermia becomes an immediate threat. From there, the trade routes ascended into the brutal, oxygen-starved elevations of the Pamir Mountains, where winter temperatures routinely dropped below -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The route was plagued by sandstorms so violent and blinding that they could strip the skin off an unprotected face. How exactly does a pristine, fragile commodity like fine silk thread or an intricate textile survive this apocalyptic environment? The answer lies in the physiological marvel and the profound, legendary stubbornness of the two-humped Bactrian camel. To understand the eastward and westward flow of ancient textiles, one must first confront the visceral, highly aromatic reality of the camel. These animals were not chosen by ancient traders for their mild, cooperative temperaments. Camels are notoriously foul-tempered, prone to spitting deeply unpleasant digestive fluids, kicking with bone-shattering force, and emitting bodily odors that defy polite linguistic description. They fundamentally do not like to be ridden, and they make their displeasure known constantly. Yet they were the absolute, undeniable lifeblood of the overland trade routes. A single Bactrian camel could carry up to 900 pounds of cargo, nearly half a ton of weight, through environmental conditions that would slaughter a robust pack horse within 48 hours. Their biological adaptations for this hellscape were nothing short of extraordinary. To combat the blinding, abrasive sandstorms of the Taklamakan desert, the camel possesses two complete sets of eyelids, the inner set functioning precisely like translucent windshield wipers to physically scrape debris from the eyeball without losing vision. Their nostrils contain complex musculature that allows them to voluntarily shrink into narrow, tight slits, effectively blocking out blowing dust and sand from their respiratory tracts. But it is the hump that dictates the survival of the caravan. A healthy Bactrian camel stores energy not as water, as the popular playground myth suggests, but as highly concentrated fat. A camel can store up to 100 pounds of this fat in each of its two towering, 18-inch humps. This massive, localized energy reserve allows the animal to march for an entire month without a single bite of food, and a full week without a single drop of water. When a chronically dehydrated camel finally reaches an oasis or a watering hole, it does not sip delicately. The animal undergoes a staggering physiological rehydration process, capable of consuming 25 to 30 gallons of water in a single, sustained binge. The visual indicator of a brutal, punishing journey was the hump itself. As the animal metabolized its fat reserves in the absence of desert forage, the humps would literally deflate, shrinking and drooping pathetically over the animal's side like empty, hairy sacks of skin. The human beings who drove these animals lived in equally harsh conditions, smelling profoundly of sweat, animal musk, and heavy, unwashed wool. In the freezing altitudes of the Pamir Mountains, camel drivers wore immensely thick, felted wool caps to shield against the wind and snow, and coats with extra-long sleeves to protect their hands from agonizing frostbite. When traversing solid ice in the mountain passes, the drivers had to physically pack loose sand onto the frozen trails by hand, just to give the camels wide, soft, padded feet enough traction to avoid slipping and breaking their legs. When the caravan halted for the night in the bitter snow, the camel drivers had to remain vigilant. Exhausted camels were explicitly prevented from lying down to rest for at least 2 hours after stopping. Why? Because if a massive, overheated camel immediately rested its body on the frozen ground, its intense body heat would quickly melt the snow beneath it. That water would then rapidly refreeze directly against the animal's skin in the negative temperatures, risking a sudden, highly expensive death by hypothermia. This was the grinding, filthy, and terrifying crucible through which all Eastern luxury goods had to pass. Very few individual human beings ever traveled the Silk Road from one end to the other, despite what the legendary accounts of Marco Polo might lead you to believe. Goods made their way westward in a piecemeal, staggered fashion. They were passed along a vast chain of intermediaries, loaded, unloaded, heavily taxed, and traded countless times. The caravans would stop at fortresses and caravanserais, large, fortified guest houses that acted as the motels and truck stops of the ancient world. Here, amid the deafening braying of animals, the chaotic bartering in dozens of different dialects, and the overwhelming, eye-watering stench of manure, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies, raw silk fibers and finished textiles exchanged hands. With each transaction, the traders took their cut, driving the final price of the commodities exponentially higher as they inched toward the Mediterranean. This cross-continental logistical miracle, reliant entirely on the digestive tract of the camel and the endurance of the merchant, was the delivery system for the materials that would eventually transform European fashion. It set the stage for one of the greatest technological, mathematical, and ergonomic leaps in the history of human clothing: the invention of the knitted loop. The physics of pre-knitting and the tyranny of the loom. Before we dive into the sheer, unadulterated vanity of early European knitting, we have to talk about the physical constraints of human clothing prior to the knitting needle. For thousands upon thousands of years, the vast majority of human textiles were woven. Weaving, at its core mechanical level, is a binary system of intersecting threads. You have the stationary threads, known as the warp, and the active threads, known as the weft, which pass over and under the warp at strict, unforgiving right angles. Woven fabric is fantastic for many things. It is strong, it is highly durable, and it is exceptionally effective for making everything from sturdy ship sails to heavy tapestries and flat bedsheets. However, when it comes to the complex, three-dimensional geometry of the human body, woven fabric possesses one glaring, highly uncomfortable physiological flaw. It has virtually zero inherent elasticity. Unless a tailor deliberately cuts the woven cloth on the diagonal, a technique known as the bias cut, which wastes vast amounts of expensive fabric and only yields a modest, restrictive stretch. Woven cloth simply cannot conform tightly to the articulated curves, hinges, and swelling muscles of the human body without severely restricting movement or cutting off blood flow. The historical and archaeological record suggests that the human yearning for stretchy, form-fitting garments is ancient, rooted in the basic biological desire for both warmth and unobstructed mobility. Long before the invention of the pair of knitting needles we recognize today, early textile artisans experimented with a predecessor technique known as nalbinding. Translating roughly from Norwegian as needle binding. This ancient, painstaking method predates true knitting by thousands of years. Fragments of nalbinding have been excavated by archaeologists in Israel dating back 10,000 years, and in Germany dating to nearly 8,000 years before the Common Era. It was famously practiced by the Vikings, who needed incredibly thick, warm garments to survive the Scandinavian winters, but it was also widely utilized in the deserts of ancient Egypt. To the untrained, modern eye, a piece of fabric made via nalbinding looks suspiciously like heavy, rustic knitting. But its mechanical construction is vastly different, and frankly, far more tedious. Nalbinding utilizes a single, large needle, often carved from bone, antler, or wood, and a finite, pre-cut length of yarn. To create the fabric, the artisan must pull the entire length of the yarn completely through each individual loop, tying a series of complex, interlocking knots. Because it requires pulling the whole string through, you cannot use a continuous ball of yarn. New lengths of yarn must be constantly and laboriously spliced into the working thread. The resulting fabric is incredibly dense and nearly indestructible. Because the structure is fundamentally knotted, it will not easily unravel if a thread breaks, but it is remarkably slow to produce. Many early textiles found in Roman and Egyptian archaeological sites, such as the famous 3rd to 5th century Romano-Egyptian toe socks, were initially misidentified by eager 20th century archaeologists as early knitting, when in fact they were constructed using the tedious, Coptic stitch of nalbinding. The monumental, earth-shattering leap in textile technology occurred when an unknown, unrecorded genius realized a fundamental truth of physics. One did not need to pull the entire length of yarn through the loop. By keeping the active loops open and safely suspended on a second needle, a single, continuous, unbroken thread could be pulled through existing loops in infinitely repeating rows. This was the birth of true hand knitting. The resulting fabric was an ergonomic revelation. Because it was constructed entirely of interconnected, microscopic loops rather than right angles, knitted fabric acted like thousands of tiny springs. It stretched effortlessly in multiple directions and then brilliantly snapped back into its original shape. It was highly breathable, incredibly insulating because the loops trapped pockets of warm air against the skin, and most importantly, it could be mathematically sculpted in 3 dimensions. By simply increasing or decreasing the number of loops on the needles, an artisan could shape a tube of fabric to wrap perfectly around the sharp point of a heel, the hinge of a knee, or the delicate tip of a finger without a single, bulky woven seam. The exact geographic origin of true, two-needle knitting remains highly debated among textile historians and archaeologists. This is largely due to the frustratingly perishable nature of organic fibers. Wool, cotton, and silk rot rapidly when exposed to moisture, soil microbes, and oxygen. We will likely never find the very first piece of knitting. However, the arid, desiccating environments of the Middle East and North Africa have offered up the earliest definitive, undeniable proof. The oldest undisputed, surviving examples of true knitting are a series of startlingly complex cotton socks excavated in Egypt, dating to between the 11th and 13th centuries. Listener, these are not crude, primitive caveman prototypes. These Egyptian socks feature impossibly fine gauges, sophisticated multicolor stranded patterns, and highly engineered short-row heels. A short-row heel is a complex mathematical shaping technique that explicitly requires the knitter to know how to execute the purl stitch, the exact opposite of a knit stitch, which pushes the bump of the loop to the back of the fabric. The sheer sophistication, planning, and structural integrity of these 11th century Egyptian socks strongly implies that the technology of knitting had already been evolving, unrecorded, for centuries prior. But the critical juncture for European history, and the moment knitting transitioned from a comfortable Middle Eastern garment into a wildly obsessive European status symbol, occurred when this revolutionary, multi-needle technology traveled westward, carried along the vast trade networks and military conquests from the Islamic world into the Iberian Peninsula. The tech transfer and the treasures of Las Hulgas. Let us physically move our narrative westward, to the sun-baked landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, what is now modern-day Spain and Portugal. During the Middle Ages, the Islamic presence in Spain, known as Al-Andalus, acted as the primary conduit for advanced Eastern technologies entering Europe. Islamic artisans of the era were the undisputed masters of the textile universe. They possessed a profound, highly guarded understanding of sericulture, the rearing of silkworms, complex dye chemistry, and highly advanced loom technology. When the technology of true knitting crossed the Mediterranean in the 12th and 13th centuries, it did not arrive as a quaint, cozy domestic hobby for grandmothers to pass the time by the hearth. It arrived as a highly classified, wildly expensive, state-of-the-art technological export. The earliest European knitted items were completely and totally out of reach for the common agrarian population. They were the exclusive, jealously guarded domain of royalty, nobility, and the highest echelons of the Catholic Church. The historical evidence for this extreme exclusivity is not merely textual. It is wildly, undeniably physical. And to find it, archaeologists had to dig deep into the looted, stone sarcophagi of medieval Spanish monarchs. We are traveling to the Abbey of Santa Maria la Real de las Huelgas, Las Huelgas, a massive, fortified royal monastery situated near the city of Burgos in northern Spain. Founded in the late 12th century, this abbey served as the primary pantheon and burial site for the Castilian royal family throughout the 13th century. While many of these royal tombs were aggressively plundered by highly motivated grave robbers over the intervening centuries, the mid-20th century opening of the remaining undisturbed tombs for scientific research yielded an unprecedented trove of perfectly preserved medieval textiles. The specific tomb that absolutely stunned the archaeological and textile community belonged to Prince Fernando de la Cerda, Fernando de la Tierda, the great-grandson of King Alfonso VII, who died in the year 1275. Because his heavy stone tomb had remained astonishingly undisturbed by looters, the prince was found exactly as he was laid to rest nearly 700 years prior, providing flawless, undisturbed snapshot of medieval royal vanity, hygiene, and spiritual belief. When the researchers carefully opened the sarcophagus, they found the inner coffin lined with rich fabrics of Moorish origin. Inside lay the mummified corpse of the prince. He was dressed in multiple layers of opulent fabric, including an embroidered cap heavily enriched with precious stones resting on his mummified skull, linen breeches held up with a leather belt, 3 separate garments cut from the same rich, woven fabric featuring luxurious fur linings, and silver-plated spurs of Moorish design affixed to his feet. His right hand was placed deliberately on the hilt of his sword. But it was the seemingly innocuous items placed gently under the mummified prince's head that completely rewrote European textile history. Propping up the royal skull were a series of highly elaborate, knitted silk cushions. Furthermore, nestled among the grave goods were finely knitted silk gloves. These artifacts demonstrate a level of tactile craftsmanship that frankly defies modern comprehension. The cushion covers were not made of chunky, thick wool. They were knitted from razor-thin silk yarn at an astonishing gauge of approximately 20 stitches per inch. To achieve this microscopic, maddening density, the medieval Islamic artisans employed by the Spanish royals would have used knitting needles no thicker than a standard modern sewing needle, roughly 1 millimeter in diameter. Imagine the sheer eye strain, the cramping hands, the infinite patience required to manually manipulate thousands upon thousands of microscopic loops of slippery silk thread just to make a pillow cover. The visual design of these knitted artifacts presents a fascinating ideological contradiction, highlighting the pragmatic, highly complicated realities of global trade and cultural exchange. The Spanish Christian royals were actively, violently engaged in the territorial conflicts of the Reconquista, Reconquista, a centuries-long effort to expel the Islamic Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Yet they so deeply coveted the technological superiority and aesthetic brilliance of Islamic craftsmanship that they quite literally took it to the grave. The intricately knitted patterns on Prince Fernando's silk cushions prominently feature the royal family armory, the classic heraldic symbols of Christian royalty. But seamlessly integrated right into the Christian heraldry is stylized Arabic kufik script. The repeating Arabic word knitted into the pillow, holding the dead Christian prince's head, is baraka, which translates directly to blessing. The fact that a high-ranking Catholic prince carried an Islamic blessing into the afterlife speaks volumes about the perceived supernatural weight and the immense earthly value of this textile. The craftsmanship was so highly regarded that one particular royal pillow from this era, also found at Las Huelgas, even bears the woven signature of its creator, an artisan named Hussein, proving that individual master craftsmen were highly recognized, named, and valued across religious lines. Why, the modern observer might logically ask, would one take knitted cushions to the afterlife? The physical reality of death, decomposition, and putrefaction was deeply, intimately understood by medieval royals. A burial was not merely a sad disposal of biological remains. It was a highly theatrical, intensely political display of absolute wealth and power, engineered to secure status both in the memory of the living and in the eternal realm of the dead. To be buried surrounded by perfectly tensioned, 20-stitch per inch knitted silk was the 13th century equivalent of being buried inside a custom-built, solid gold spacecraft. It communicated absolute, unquestionable dominance over the physical world and exclusive access to the most advanced, expensive technology known to humanity. The prince was not the only one. The tomb of Leonor of Castile, the wife of Jaime I of Aragon who died in 1244, was also found packed with similar knitted riches. In other parts of Europe, early knitting was strictly confined to the Catholic Church, used to make delicate relic purses for holding the shattered bones of saints and highly ornate liturgical gloves for bishops. Knitting was, quite literally, holy. The anatomy of vanity, the Renaissance leg. As the centuries progressed, this multi-needle technology slowly bled outward from the heavily guarded workshops of the Iberian Peninsula, moving north into Italy, Germany, France, and eventually the cold, damp shores of England. By the mid-14th century, the knowledge of knitting had become culturally entrenched enough to appear in high religious art. A fascinating series of artworks known collectively as the Knitting Madonnas, including works by Italian painter Tommaso da Modena, around 1325, and Master Bertram of Minden, 1400 altarpiece in Germany, explicitly depict the Virgin Mary calmly knitting. She is not just knitting. She is shown doing highly complex color work, knitting in the round on 4 needles while attending to the infant Christ child. This normalization of the craft set the stage for a spectacular, continent-wide explosion of sheer, unadulterated human vanity. To properly understand the frantic, sweaty European obsession with the knitted silk stocking that followed, one must radically adjust their modern understanding of historical sex appeal. If you were a wealthy aristocrat in the 16th and 17th centuries, the ultimate focal point of male physical beauty was not the chest, the broadness of the shoulders, or the sharpness of the jawline. It was the calf. The male leg was considered one of the most aesthetically beautiful, highly eroticized, and deeply desired parts of the human anatomy. Even male servants, specifically tall footmen, were prized and hired by 19th century households purely because they possessed a fine pair of legs to show off the household's wealth. During the earlier Middle Ages, long tunics and heavy robes had mercifully hidden the lower body from scrutiny. But a radical, unforgiving shift in fashion in the mid-16th century introduced extremely short breeches and doublets that terminated sharply above the knee. This sudden lack of fabric ruthlessly exposed the entirety of the gentleman's lower leg to the critical, judging eye of the royal court. If you had skinny, shapeless calves, everyone knew it. Prior to the proliferation of the knitted stocking, covering the leg required wearing woven cloth hose. As we discussed earlier, weaving has no stretch. Because woven fabric is a grid of right angles, tailors had to perform agonizing geometrical gymnastics cutting heavy linen or itchy wool strictly on the diagonal bias to force a minimal, highly restrictive amount of stretch. The garments were then heavily seamed, stitched, and aggressively tailored to match the precise, lumpy contours of the specific client's leg. The physical reality of wearing bias-cut cloth hose was an absolute sensory nightmare. They were notoriously stiff, incredibly prone to chafing behind the knee, and deeply difficult to maneuver into. Removing them after a long day of walking or dancing was an ordeal bordering on physical comedy. The 16th century Italian biographer Giorgio Vasari recorded a highly telling, slightly pathetic anecdote regarding the painter Cristofano Gerardi. After attending an exhausting evening party, the tired painter managed to pry one tight-fitting, sweat-dampened cloth stocking off his leg, but found the second completely immobile, stuck fast to his swollen calf. Utterly defeated by his own clothing, he simply gave up and went to sleep with one leg bare and the other trapped in its woolen prison. The following morning, it required the concerted physical effort of 2 full-grown adult servants to remove the stocking. One servant had to violently pin the painter's leg to the mattress, while the other hauled backward with all his might on the fabric. As the servants wrestled with the garment, the painter reportedly lay on the bed screaming in frustration, cursing the clothes, and him who invented such fashions that kept men bound in chains like slaves. The arrival of the fully fashioned, seamless knitted silk stocking was an anatomical, sartorial, and psychological revelation. Because the fabric was a continuous grid of interlocking loops, it slid over the sharp bone of the heel with buttery ease, instantly contracting to tightly grip the ankle and swelling perfectly to embrace the muscular bulk of the calf, entirely free of bulky, chafing seams. The tight fit profoundly emphasized the underlying musculature, drawing the eye exactly where 16th century vanity demanded. Popes, kings, and noblemen demanded perfectly fitted knitted silk hosiery, often dyed in brilliant red or stark black, to show off their athletic prowess. The sensory and tactile production of these silk garments was an incredibly elaborate, multi-step chemical process. When raw silk is first unspooled from the cocoon, spun into thread, and knitted, the resulting fabric is surprisingly rough, stiff, and bulky. This is due to a natural protein called sericin, a stubborn, glue-like substance secreted by the Bombyx mori silkworm to bind its cocoon together. To achieve the luxurious drape we associate with silk, the raw knitted stockings had to undergo a highly specific chemical finishing process called degumming. The freshly knitted, stiff stockings were thrown into vats of boiling, soapy water to physically melt and wash away the sericin glue. The transformation was magical. The removal of the protective protein left the silk incredibly soft, smooth, and shockingly transparent. Once degummed, the dripping wet stockings were wrestled onto rigid wooden tools called sock blocks. These blocks forced the elastic fabric into the exact, idealized shape of a perfect human leg while it dried, stretching the microscopic loops and setting them into permanent alignment. The result was a shockingly lightweight garment. An extant 17th century fine silk stocking discovered in a burial in Turku, Finland, weighs a mere 30.1 grams. They were frequently embellished with intricate clocking, patterns, raised, three-dimensional decorative motifs knitted directly into the fabric at the ankle, which stood out in high relief and caught the light, further drawing attention to the slimness of the lower leg. Knitters worked under intense pressure, operating in a high-stakes luxury market. Historical guild documents explicitly warn artisans against handling the expensive, degummed silk yarns with dirty hands, lest the sweat, oil, and grime spoil the vibrant, wildly expensive dyes and ruin the magnificent tactile quality of the final product. Black silk stockings were the absolute pinnacle of expensive fashion, projecting a somber, wealthy authority, but they required a complex, highly volatile chemical dyeing process. Artisans utilized the so-called lasagna method, physically boiling the delicate knitted silk in layered vats of tannin-rich organic materials, such as crushed alderbark, mixed heavily with iron sulfate. The iron reacted aggressively with the tannins to create a deep, permanent black color. But it was a dangerous game of chemistry. If the chemical ratio was even slightly miscalculated or left in the vat too long, the corrosive iron would literally eat through the delicate silk fibers, utterly destroying hundreds of hours of painstaking manual labor. And the labor was indeed staggering. Modern experimental archaeological reconstructions, utilizing microscopic 1mm needles to recreate these historical artifacts, require casting on an agonizing 288 tiny loops for a single, adult-sized stocking. Historical accounts from the era dictate that a professional, highly trained master knitter working at full speed would require anywhere from 12 days to an entire month to produce just one pair of fine silk stockings. The modern reconstruction of the Turku stocking required an eye-watering 215 to 260 hours of continuous manual labor per individual sock. It is absolutely no wonder that the English Queen Elizabeth I, upon receiving her very first pair of knitted black silk stockings as a New Year's gift in 1561 from her royal silk woman, Mrs. Montague, essentially refused to ever wear woven cloth hose again. The Queen declared the knitted silk to be infinitely finer, softer, and more pleasing to the skin, setting off a nationwide craze that would change the English economy forever. The physics of defeating gravity. However, solving the elasticity problem and achieving the perfect, skin-tight fit created an entirely new, deeply humiliating physics problem for the European elite. The interlocking loops of a knitted stocking provided brilliant horizontal stretch across the wide girth of the calf muscle. But the 16th century had not yet invented modern elastic bands. Rubber, derived from the sap of Mesoamerican trees, would not be successfully integrated into European textile thread to create stretchable waistbands or cuffs until the 1820s. Therefore, a perfectly fitted, thigh-high or knee-high knitted silk stocking was entirely at the merciless whims of gravity. How, the endlessly curious mind must ask, does a wealthy courtier confidently stride across a marble ballroom, bowing to the Queen, without his wildly expensive silk hosiery collapsing around his ankles in a puddling, wrinkled mess of failure? The physiological mechanics of the human leg provided the primary anchor point. The solution was the garter, a narrow, completely unstretchy band of woven fabric, decorative ribbon, or occasionally buckled leather. For knee-length stockings, the wearer would pull the tightly fitted silk all the way up over the muscular bulge of the calf, and then tie the garter forcefully around the leg just below the knee, in the small anatomical depression where the leg is at its most slender. The sudden outward flare of the calf muscle below the garter and the hard bone of the knee above it acted as a physical barricade, mechanically preventing the tightly bound fabric from sliding downward. But what about the much longer, thigh-high stockings favored by men wearing exceptionally short, trunk-hose breeches? For these massive tubes of silk, the physiological anchor of the calf was completely useless. The silk had to be hauled all the way up the fleshy thigh, a profoundly difficult shape to grip due to the natural, downward taper of the human leg. In these instances, the tops of the stockings were equipped with eyelets and physically tied, or pointed, using laces directly to the bottom hem of an internal waist belt or to the bottom of the gentleman's doublet jacket. Essentially, the intimidating, sword-wielding Renaissance gentleman was wearing a highly complex, highly restrictive silk suspender belt. Later in the Victorian era, top lace trims known as welts were knitted into the garments, with a significantly denser stitch to aid in friction and grip against the skin. The social anxiety surrounding stocking failure was palpable and highly documented. Drooping, wrinkled hose were not just considered a minor sartorial faux pas. They were a profound visual indicator of moral decay, slovenliness, or severe public intoxication. The 17th-century Dutch painter Jan Steen, explicitly utilized the visual of sagging stockings in his famous painting, Robbery in a Brothel, to instantly identify the victim as a helpless, utterly incapacitated lush whose garters had failed him, leaving him vulnerable to thieves. Even the most powerful monarchs in history were not immune to the embarrassing physics of failing hosiery. The historical record is littered with wardrobe malfunctions involving dropped garters or torn fabric under immense tension. The absolute necessity of keeping the stocking violently taut over the calf to show off the leg meant the delicate silk was constantly under immense structural stress. A snagged thread on a wooden chair or a loosely tied ribbon during a vigorous dance could result in a catastrophic, highly visible failure, turning the ultimate status symbol into an object of immediate, devastating courtly ridicule. State secrets, monopolies, and the threat of the machine. Because knitted garments, particularly silk stockings, were in such rabid demand across all levels of society that could afford them, and because they commanded such exorbitant prices, the specific knowledge of exactly how to manipulate those microscopic loops was fiercely protected. Today, knitting is broadly stereotyped as a gentle, quiet domestic pastime. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, fine luxury knitting was an aggressive, male-dominated, highly militant corporate enterprise. The men who mastered this craft formed powerful, exclusive professional knitting guilds across Europe. These guilds operated much like modern defense contractors, strictly controlling the dissemination of intellectual property and regulating the exact quality and price of the goods. To gain entry into a knitting guild, a young apprentice had to endure years of grueling, unpaid manual labor, and eventually pass exceptionally rigorous, highly stressful standardized tests. A master test might require the flawless production of a perfectly proportioned shirt, a densely felted cap, and a pair of intricately patterned stockings, proving absolute, undeniable mastery over three-dimensional mathematical shaping. The guilds deliberately restricted the supply of master knitters to artificially inflate the price of their highly coveted garments. The economic impact of the knitting industry became so massive that it literally drove national legislation. In England, the domestic production of sturdy, knitted woolen caps became a foundational pillar of the national economy. These caps were often tightly knitted in the round on 4 needles, and then aggressively boiled and pounded until the wool fibers locked together into a thick, waterproof felt. When this specific hat-making industry faced an economic downturn in the late 16th century due to shifting fashions, the English Parliament intervened with staggering, authoritarian force to protect the knitters. The resulting legislation was the Cappers Act of 1571. This bizarre, highly specific, slightly tyrannical law explicitly dictated that every single person in England over the age of 6 years old, with the strict exception of maids, ladies, noble personages, and high-ranking gentlemen, was legally required by the state to wear a domestically produced, knitted woolen cap on their head every single Sunday and on all holy days. The punishment for being caught bareheaded, or wearing a fancy imported velvet hat, was a painfully steep fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence per day of the offense. Think about that for a moment. The government was literally forcing its citizenry to wear knitted hats under threat of financial ruin, purely to ensure the textile workers maintained their monopoly and didn't starve. It is against this intense backdrop of economic protectionism, guild paranoia, and royal vanity that the greatest existential threat to the hand knitter emerged: the terrifying, clanking specter of automation. In 1589, an English clergyman named William Lee, achieved the seemingly impossible. Frustrated by the agonizingly slow speed of hand knitting, and, according to apocryphal legends, annoyed that a woman he was courting was paying more attention to her knitting needles than to him, Lee spent years obsessively analyzing the precise physics of the human hand manipulating yarn. He successfully translated these complex biological movements into a massive contraption of wood and iron, inventing the stocking frame, the world's very first mechanical knitting machine. Technically speaking, the machine used an action closer to crochet than true knitting, utilizing a vast row of hooked, bearded needles to pull entire rows of loops simultaneously, vastly outstripping the speed of the fastest human hands on Earth. While a master hand knitter, working until his fingers bled, could produce perhaps 2 pairs of fine stockings in a week, Lee's terrifying new machine threatened to produce dozens in a fraction of the time. Believing he had secured his fortune and solved the hosiery crisis forever, Lee managed to gain an audience with Queen Elizabeth I in the early 1590s, brought to her by Lord Hunsdon, a chamberlain of the court. He proudly presented the queen with a machine-made stocking, expecting a lucrative royal patent and infinite wealth. The queen's reaction was swift, devastating, and deeply grounded in cold, hard macroeconomic reality. Elizabeth looked at the mechanically produced garment. She understood instantly what it meant for the tens of thousands of commoners who relied on hand knitting for their meager survival, and she flatly refused to grant Lee a patent. Her recorded response to the inventor is a masterpiece of royal technological suppression. She said, "I have too much love for my poor people who obtain their bread by the employment of knitting to give my money to forward an invention that will tend to their ruin by depriving them of employment and thus making them beggars." Elizabeth I effectively banned the dawn of the Industrial Revolution to protect the humble, interlocking loop. Lee was ultimately forced to flee to France with his machine, where he eventually died in poverty, while the hand knitters of Europe continued to desperately click their 1mm needles together, racing to satisfy the insatiable, driving vanity of the royal calf. The journey of the knitted loop is a bizarre, fascinating testament to the staggering physical endurance and sheer ingenuity of human beings. To trace the origin of the flawless, translucent, black silk stocking clinging tightly to the muscular leg of a 16th-century monarch is to trace a line directly backward through time, space, and human obsession. It bypasses the heavily guarded secrets of the male knitting guilds, stretches past the dark, looted sarcophagi of Spanish princes clutching Islamic blessings in the dark, and extends all the way out into the blistering, freezing, wind-scoured expanse of the Asian steppe. It is a story built entirely on the sagging, fat-depleted humps of bad-tempered camels, the stench of unwashed caravan drivers, the horrific chafing of bias-cut cloth, and the absolute refusal of the human species to accept the stiff, unyielding boundaries of a woven piece of fabric.